In my world, I'll tell you that it's good to have things relatively back to normal. It seems like it's been forever, kind of waiting for my mother-in-law to return her daughter back to me. But we're glad. You know, it started out. You know, as Lisa and I first started talking about it, she was going to go up for a couple weeks and help her mom and that turned into, well, better stay for a month, to help get through, some of these process and whatnot that she had to do. And well, that turned into forever. And, so we're finally here. Forever, I guess, is a little bit long, but it was a long time. When she told me she was coming home, it just seemed like it was going to take forever. But I'm glad that the return is home, that she has returned home. I would say this, though. I think it's been 6 weeks, I think, that she's been gone. I would say you have, some of you guys that are married, you understand this. You know how many words she has built up over 6 weeks? I picked her up at Friday night at midnight, and she still hasn't stopped. So, I'm just saying, if you have a chance after the service, please visit with her and use some of those words up. Might save me a little bit of. Anyways, we're glad that she's home. But I'm sure we can all relate to that, right? I mean, we've been at a place where we wanted something to happen, but it just seemed to take forever, right? I remember when I was waiting for my driver's license. 16. You couldn't wait for that to happen. Or maybe graduating from high school. Right around the corner. It seemed like it was taking forever in order to get there. But I'm sure we all have those things that we looked forward to, those things that we wanted to happen. But let me ask you this. If you knew something was going to happen, if God had said to you, this is what I'm going to do in your life, how long would you wait for a promise from God? I mean, that kind of puts things in a little bit different perspective, doesn't it? Would you wait a year? Would you wait, maybe a couple of years? Would you wait 5 years? Would you wait 10 years? I mean, what if it was longer than that? What if it took decades before God responded, before he brought about what he had promised that would happen in your life? I mean, you look at our world today, our culture today, and I'll tell you, I mean, we have trouble, going through, a commercial on TV, don't we? I mean, we start to twitch, that 30 or 45 seconds or however long it takes for that commercial to be done. I mean, even, we pull out our phones and we start to get impatient if it doesn't load immediately, if it doesn't go quite fast enough. Now, not all of you, some of you understand and remember when dial-up was a thing, right? I mean, this is lightning fast today, but we are so impatient. And that's the thing. I mean, we pull up to a stoplight, and if the person in front of us doesn't go immediately, when the light turns green, what do? We honk at them, right? I mean, hey, wake up there. I've got places to go. We are so impatient. And that's the thing, right? Patience is not our strong suit, not in our society. But if we're going to look at Luke chapter 2 for a little bit this morning. And there's a man named Simeon that, he waited his entire adult life on a promise from God. And we'll see in the midst of that account that it wasn't just him, that there was also this lady named Anna who waited even longer than he did, all waiting for a promise from God. Now, if you were here last week, you probably will remember that we talked about the Magi, right? The wise men. And even if you weren't here last week, you're familiar with that. You're familiar with those wise men who saw the star in the sky, and they followed this, and eventually it led them to the young boy Jesus. They responded immediately to what they saw and eventually found him. Well, this week in Luke, he gives us kind of the flip side of this. Not talking about outsiders from a long ways away, but insiders, those who were a part of the Jewish world, those who had been waiting all of their lives, for this to happen. They weren't watching the sky. They were watching what was right in front of them. You see, theirs was not a journey of miles and miles and miles as it was for those wise men. Theirs was a journey of years and years. And again, I would say this: if you had to wait that long, would you have kept watching? Would you have kept waiting? Would you have kept believing that God was going to do something if you had to wait that long? As long as Simeon did, or as long as Anna did. And we'll get into some specifics of that in just a minute. But I wonder, even in the middle of that, if we would have waited, I wonder if we would have recognized when that moment actually came. Or would we have already given up? Would we have already kind of written it off and said, yeah, I guess God doesn't care, or I guess he's not interested, or I guess maybe I missed it, or whatever it might be. Well, Luke chapter 2 introduces us to a couple of people who understood what it was like to wait. And we're talking about not just, waiting for Christmas to arrive so we can open gifts that are under the tree, or waiting for a plane to land, or, those kind of things. But these two who waited for God to fulfill his promises. Now, Simeon had a promise from the Spirit of God, but was not given a date. And we'll see that as we open God's Word this morning. Anna, we're told, prayed and fasted year after year. And for both of them, when the moment finally came, they both recognized Jesus immediately. Because they weren't just waiting, they were watching. They weren't just sitting back, with their eyes closed and their feet up, waiting for God to do something. They were actively watching, they were actively waiting to see. Now, I think we understand that some people, when they are waiting, they wait and they get bitter, right? They get bitter and they get angry. Some people wait and they begin to lose hope. They begin to think, well, I guess this isn't going to happen. I guess God isn't going to show up. Well, Anna and Simeon were two of those who waited expectantly. So I want us to listen to just a small glimpse of their story. And remember, this is just a small glimpse of their story. We don't have all the color and all the detail that was a part of their lives, and all the struggle even that led them to this point. But here they are. Let me read a little of this. In chapter 2 of Luke, in verse 25, it says this: "And behold, there was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon. And this man was just and devout, waiting for the consolation of Israel. And the Holy Spirit was upon him. And it had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not see death before he had seen the Lord's Christ. So he came by the Spirit into the temple, and when the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him according to the custom of the law, he took him up in his arms and blessed God and said, 'Lord, now you are letting your servant depart in peace, according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all people, a light to bring revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel.' And Joseph and his mother marveled at those things which were spoken of him. And then Simeon blessed them and said to Mary his mother, 'Behold, this child is destined for the fall and rising of many in Israel, and for a sign which will be spoken against. Yes, a sword will pierce through your own soul also, and the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed.' Now there was one, Anna, a prophetess, a daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. She was of a great age and had lived with a husband 7 years from her virginity, and this woman was a widow of about 84 years, who did not depart from the temple, but served God with fastings and prayers night and day. And coming in that instant, she gave thanks to the Lord and spoke of him to all those who looked for redemption in Jerusalem." So what's happening here? And I know this is a snippet out of the lives of some people who lived 2,000 years ago from a very different culture from what we're used to, a very different, religious atmosphere, very different customs, very different, processes that they would have gone through in order to, take Jesus to the temple and all of those things, very different from us. But essentially, it was a young couple who brought their child to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord in the temple as the law of Moses required for them to do. So what I want us to hear in the middle of this is that what was happening in their lives was just ordinary faithfulness. There wasn't anything extraordinary about what they were doing. It was routine obedience, nothing flashy. It was just a young couple who were doing what God had said, this is what you ought to do. This is how you ought to conduct yourselves. When you have a child, you bring him, and there was a whole procedure. We won't get into all of that, but they were just following that. And here's the first thing that I want us to notice. It's right in the middle of that ordinary moment that God reveals something life-changing, world-changing, really, in the middle of it. And how often that happens, I believe, where God shows up in those ordinary moments of our lives. Not just in the extraordinary, I would say actually rarely in those big flashy moments, but most often in the ordinary moments of our lives, the ordinary everyday obedience of our lives. And so there's a few things I want us to notice about this account. One of the things is what Luke emphasizes. Because oftentimes what a biblical writer highlights for us that's what we need to pay attention to. So we need to watch for things that, perhaps they repeat, things that they highlight, little details that we kind of sometimes wonder, well, why did he mention that? Well, here's one thing that he highlights about Simeon, several times. He says this, first, the Holy Spirit was upon him. And then he said it had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit. And then he said it was he came by the Holy Spirit into the temple. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that this account is not just about Simeon, who was some, patient old man. It was more than that. It was deeper than that. It is a story or an account about Spirit-led expectation. In other words, there was more than just him being patient for what God would do. He was expecting God to do something. And I wonder how long we would have waited. I wonder how long, we would have waited if we known what God had said, if we knew what God was going to do. I wonder how long we would have waited before we started to get angry. Before we started to shake our fist at God and say, are you even going to do this? But I want us to notice, again, the words that Luke chooses to use, how he describes Simeon. He describes him as righteous and devout. See, this is not just, the religious, polished person. This is not somebody who, shines himself up and puts on, his best clothes and comes to church every Sunday morning. It's deeper than that. It's more than that. When he talks about someone who is righteous, someone who is devout, he's talking about his character. He's talking about a man who took God seriously. This was more than just, showing up in church. It's the kind of person who, when the lights were out, when nobody was looking, he's the kind of person who still acted like he believed God. So even when he wasn't talking to anybody, he's somebody who believed that God was going to bring about what he had said to him. And you notice what Simeon does? Simeon essentially declares this. How this flies in the face, I think, of our world today. Just in our priorities and what we think about things. What does he say immediately? He says, God, now I can die in peace. That's what he's saying. Because you fulfilled what you promised in me. I got to see and I'm good. I'm good. I'm ready, to move on from here. How amazing that is, I think, in our lives, to think about that. Because really, if we consider it, we'd be fixated on, I'm going to die. Well, I'll give you a news flash. We're all headed there. I'm just saying. But we would be fixated on that. And we'd have probably spent decades and decades and decades praying that God would postpone it, right? That it would wait, because we always want to extend. But that wasn't Simeon's focus. Simeon's focus was on the promise of God. And he was so excited, he was so content to see what God had promised come about that he said, I'm good. And now you can take me in peace. You see, another thing I want us to highlight here is what he refers to here as he was waiting for the consolation of Israel. I mean, that sounds kind of weird, doesn't it? I mean, let's just admit it. I mean, sometimes we read things in our Bibles that really don't make any sense to us because we don't live in that culture. We don't live, it's not a part of our everyday lives. But for them, it was just a common way of saying that he was waiting for the coming of the Messiah. That we understand, right? He was waiting the same way that the wise men were waiting and watching. He was waiting for the arrival of Jesus Christ. He was waiting for God to keep his promise, not just for him. The implications would stretch far beyond just Simeon. Simeon, God had promised and said, you will see him before you die. But the promise was the implication of the Messiah that would have an effect on all of Israel and all of the world, ultimately, is what he refers to. Something that Israel had been longing for generations. But unlike, most of those that we saw last week, remember the ones that the wise men went and talked to? When they went and talked to Herod, and Herod went and talked to the religious leaders of the day? I mean, what Simeon saw, most of the others weren't even paying attention to. And Luke tells us that Simeon received a very specific promise from God, that he would not see death until he had seen the Lord's Christ. Now, God gave him a promise, but you notice he did not give him a timeline. See, I think that's hard for us. There was no date. There was no countdown. There was no, Simeon, in 5 years from now. He didn't even say within 5 years. See, at least, I remember when I was waiting for my 16th birthday so I could go and get my driver's license, there was a set time out there, right? We were waiting for this to you could see it when it was going to happen. But could you imagine waiting for something and you had no idea when it was going to happen? Just that he would see it. But that's the kind of promise that really will either make you cynical or it will grow and strengthen your faith, one or the other. It will reveal one or the other. But how often we get impatient. Is that not true? I mean, not just impatient, but how often we get angry. We get angry at God because he doesn't do what we want when we want it done. But not Simeon. But it's not just Simeon, because Luke tacks on this other this little episode, if you will, on the end of it about this woman named Anna. And again, what Luke chooses to emphasize is important. He says she is a prophetess. She is advanced in years. She was married for 7 years and then widowed. And it's hard for us because, our English language doesn't translate perfectly, from the Greek, and so it can mean several different things. It might mean that she was a widow at 84 years old, or it might mean that she, it could also mean that she had been a widow for 84 years. I mean, either way, it doesn't really make that much difference, does it? She was advanced in years. She was getting up there, and yet, here's the point. What Luke tells us is that all those years, she did not depart from the temple. Now, that doesn't mean she never left the temple grounds, right? It was a generalization that he was making about her life and what marked her life. She was always there. She was always there worshiping God. She was always there, he tells us, fasting and praying night and day. She didn't just show up at, Sunday morning at 10:45. She was there all the time, praying and fasting, crying out to God. Years and years of showing up. Years and years of worship. Years and years of praying. Not because she was trying to earn something, but because she was staying near to the presence of God and did not want to miss what she had been promised to see. And all those years and years, she kept believing. And years she kept expecting. Could you imagine that? Living in such a fashion that you got up every morning expecting that God could do, He might do something amazing this day. That's the kind of expectation that we're talking about. See, when I think of the word patience, I think of, kind of sitting there and waiting without grumbling. What we see in the lives of Simeon and in the life of Anna is more of an excited waiting, an excited anticipation that they demonstrated in their lives. But that's the difference, isn't it? Is how we wait, how we wait for God to act, how we wait for God to do something. I mean, some people wait and their hearts get filled with resentment. Because they want it and they want it now, right? Some people wait and they are filled with entitlement. I deserve to know. I deserve this right now. Some people wait, and while they are, and while they're waiting, they sometimes just kind of back away from God. Have you ever noticed that? Never mind other people. Have you ever done that? Where you've kind of stepped away from God because He didn't act on your timeline, because He didn't do things as quickly as you believe that He ought to do. You might have heard of this guy, this prophet. His name was Habakkuk, and in his testimony, in the record that he left behind, part of it, he stands before God and he says this. He says, "I will stand my watch. I will station myself on the ramparts, and I will look to see what you will say to me and what I will do when you correct me." I don't know if you've ever heard that before, but it's kind of a cool picture where he says to God, he promises to God, he says, "I will do this. I will stand here and I will pay attention." And do you know what God says to him? He said, "Though it might take a while, wait for it." Even if it might take a while, wait for it. Now, in the prophet's case, we don't have any idea. We don't know how long it was from his declaration, from his promise that he would stand, his watch. And when God actually began to reveal to him, began to speak to him again, we don't know. It might have been an hour. It might have been, years. We just don't know. Habakkuk doesn't tell us. But here's the thing. Here's the question. What do you do when God's promises feel like they are too slow? What do you do with that? Do you show up and keep worshiping as Anna did? Do you show up and, as Simeon did, and do you keep obeying? Do you keep following God? Do you show up like Anna did, and do you keep praying? Do you keep asking God? Do you keep laying your life even before Him? Or do you quietly just kind of quit on the inside? Maybe you do that not so quiet, and you start to get angry. See, I think we can all relate to some degree to some of those things. But here's what I have learned over the years. Maybe you haven't learned this yet. I don't know. But God doesn't operate on my timeline. I don't know why, because, I've got it all laid out, and I know exactly what I would like Him to do and when I would like Him to do it, but it seems like He operates on His timeline and not mine. And oftentimes it is only hindsight that allows us to see what God does in the waiting, how He shapes us and molds us in the waiting. See, oftentimes it's more about that than it is even about the destination. About how he crafts our character, how He molds and shapes us into the people that He would use, into the people that He could use. You know what's cool? As I thought about some of this stuff, You know, in a couple of weeks, we're going to get together on July, on January 11th, you know, on a Sunday afternoon in January, the first part of the year. We're gonna go downstairs, we're going to have lunch, we're going to visit together, and then we're going to come back up here, and we're going to talk about the next 5 years of our church. We're going to talk about where I'm convinced God is taking us as a church. Much of it, you know, we're already aware of, but just to kind of put some color and detail to that, you know, Miss Emily and Miss Sam are going to take care of kids, so we got something happening for them so that everybody can be a part of that. But you know what is amazing as I've looked back at some of this? Some of this stuff that God is beginning to do here in our church, He began in me 30 years ago. Much of that I had set aside. I had put aside, you know, and said, I guess God's not going to do this. I guess He's not going to use this. And there were times along the way when I looked back and I thought, all of this effort, all of this study, all of these ideas and this picture that God so clearly implanted in my heart, why in the world would He not have used it? And here we are. And all the things that God has done in me between then and now. More than that, all the things that God has done in all of you between then and now. See, this is not just about one person. This is about what God has done and how He has molded and shaped us and brought us as a church to the exact place and moment in history. We might talk about that next week, actually, about how God does that, how He brings us to exactly the right moment in history so that He can do amazing things. So you see, oftentimes it's not until we get to the end where we realize what God has done all along the way. You see, Simeon, well, Luke wants to make sure, I think, that we don't just chalk this up to, well, this is some kind of coincidence, right? You see, Simeon didn't just wander in and get lucky this day that Jesus showed up there. You notice what happened, didn't you? It said very clearly that the Spirit led him there. He was guided by the Spirit of the living God. And we notice this time after time, in the midst of Simeon's life, that in the middle of that, no matter how long it took, he's not just watching, but he's still listening. He's still paying attention. After decades of waiting, his heart hadn't grown dull. He hadn't become numb to the Spirit's whisper in his life. He hadn't become a cynic, thinking, God's not going to do it anyways. When the Spirit moved, Simeon noticed. When the Spirit said, go, he immediately responded. And what was the result? He saw Jesus with his own eyes. You see, here's what I believe is probably our greatest challenge today, and I think where the greatest potential in our lives lies. It is in being able to recognize God's voice. It's being able to recognize the Spirit's leading, the Spirit's prompting, as Simeon did. See, that's the key. It's the key to everything. And I would, kind of take it beyond there, and I would say this. I think the greatest thing that we can do to and for our children, for our grandchildren, for those kids that are looking to us and looking at our lives, is to help them realize that God still speaks. And when He does, help them to recognize His voice and respond. This is about far more this morning than just getting Charlie wet. It's more than that. It is a recognition, and we got to participate this morning in realizing and witnessing Charlie respond to the Spirit's prompting in his life. I don't know what that does to you, but that should send chills down us and make the hair on our necks stand up, that we got to participate in that. And every time we see that in the life of somebody else, every time we see that in our lives, we get another little glimpse of what God is doing. And imagine what God is going to do in the days ahead in His life if we continue to foster that. if we continue to encourage that, if we continue to help Charlie understand, you know what? It's not just following in obedience in believers' baptism. That means that when you believe that Jesus died, for your sin, when you ask him for forgiveness, and the next obedient step is to be baptized as he commanded, as a picture, as a declaration of the faith that is inside of you. See, we're not only teaching him to obey immediately. Our job now as a church is to help him understand, what does that look like now for the rest of your life? Because if we can do that in our young people, if our young people see that in us, we will have created what Erwin McManus refers to as an unstoppable force. A group of people who just believe God. That's what Simeon and Anna were. They were a couple of these people. By all accounts, they weren't anybody, right? But they believed God and they waited expectantly. You see, Simeon realized and recognized what everyone else missed. Why? Because his eyes were trained by faithful watching. His eyes were trained, his heart was trained by doing this over and over and over again in his life, by responding. That is why when we talk about our next process, our discipleship process, we talked about, did you hear me say something about that in the last little while? I think we mentioned it. See, at the heart of that is what I refer to as a discipleship of obedience. What does that mean? The goal is not to become legalistic and say, here's the set of rules that you need to do. No, it is to begin to train our hearts, to train our lives to respond in obedience to what God is saying. In other words, when he says this, then we do it. When he says this, we then do that. And if you create that kind of pattern in your life of just responding to what God is saying and what he will do, then you will be able to respond at the slightest whisper of his Spirit in your life. And then you begin to see God show up in those ordinary, remember that's where we began, in those ordinary moments of obedience. Those ordinary moments of faithfulness. You see, what others saw as just another family who showed up in the temple, they brought their sacrifice. They're not even worth paying attention to because they're poor. We know that because of the sacrifice they brought. It was 2 doves. That was the sacrifice that God had set. This is what you can do if you can't afford, something else. Everybody else looked at them and said, they're not really worth paying attention to. But Simeon looked. And what does Simeon say? What did he see? He saw the fulfillment of God's promise standing right in front of him. And I wonder, how many ordinary moments have we missed because we weren't paying attention? This should, if you have been walking with Jesus for any length of time in your life, this should freak you out. It haunts me. Even just thinking about what have I missed along the way? On those moments when I was so engrossed in my own life, when I was so wound up in my own stuff that I wasn't paying attention, what did I miss? Because you see, I've gotten a glimpse of what God does do. I've gotten a glimpse of what God can do. And I can only imagine the things that he wanted to do on top of that. Maybe it was a conversation that you ended up having with somebody that really felt kind of random, but it was anything but random. Maybe it was, a burden in your heart that just won't go away. See, sometimes we write these things off, and we say, oh, that's just anxiety. It might not be. It might be the Spirit of God impressing such a burden on your heart. Why? Because he wants you to do something with it. Do something about it. Maybe it's a person that you just keep running into. Maybe you see somebody at work, and then you see him at the store, and then you see him at a restaurant, and then whatever it might be. Or neighbor who just happens to be out doing things at the same time that you are. See, our minds and our hearts are not trained to pay attention to those things. And so sometimes we miss them. And again, I wonder how many of those divine appointments, and that's what they are. They are appointments that are scheduled, if you will, by God Almighty. Do we catch the weight of that? How cool that is, that God does that. Not because, we miss those things, not because God wasn't working or wasn't doing stuff. We miss those things because oftentimes we're not paying attention. Simeon didn't recognize Jesus because he was just naturally sharper than everybody else. No. He recognized Jesus because the Spirit revealed to him that, and Simeon had learned along the way to recognize his voice. See, if you've never experienced that, if you've never lived like that, in such a fashion that you have had the Spirit of God guide you as you have lived your life, then, you're missing out on some cool stuff. But Simeon, he doesn't just recognize the moment. He notices what God is doing in the middle of it. You notice what he said? He said, "For my eyes have seen your salvation." You see, we tend to just see the details, right? We tend to see, kind of just what has happened. Our Western minds are kind of trained that way. You see, he didn't say, "My eyes got to see a baby." No. He didn't say, "My eyes got to see the potential in a child in the arms of his parents." No. He didn't even say, "My eyes have seen, the symbol of Israel's redemption." No. He said, "My eyes have seen your salvation." He saw the implications of it. He immediately understood. Why? Because he had trained his heart to do so. See, but again, Simeon wasn't the only one paying attention, right? There was this other lady, this lady named Anna. And we see in her life some of the same things. When God moves, when God speaks, when God reveals himself, I wonder, do we do what they did? Do we sit up and take notice? Do we let other people know? Or do we just kind of act like it was no big deal? I think too often we either act like it's no big deal or we're just not paying attention. But Simeon and Anna didn't just see, they didn't just hear, they didn't just recognize, they did something with it. You notice that, right? What they did becomes not just a declaration of what God did, this is worship. That's what this is. It's public worship. Because when you truly recognize the hand of God, you cannot help but say something. If you pause long enough to consider the implications of that, we're nothing. We're nobody. I'm a guy from nowhere. And God would allow us to see what he is doing. More than that, God would invite us to be a part of what he's doing. I mean, that's cool. But so often we're watching for the wrong things, aren't we? But Simeon and Anna, they were watching for this first arrival of the Messiah who was coming. And when he came, they recognized him. I'll tell you, I've been in church most of my life. And I know we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. And we'll say, I know some sincere believers, people who have been following Jesus for many, many years, decades and decades, and they are so consumed with timelines and theories and endless debates about obscure issues of theology. And in the meantime, they don't even know their neighbor's name. They can argue details about things like pre-tribulation rapture and all of those kinds of things, but they wouldn't go out of their way to be a blessing to the classmate who sits right beside them. See, I want us to be careful not to become distracted and then disguise our distraction with some form of spirituality. I mean, after all, I want us to understand, we remember from last week, don't we? Remember what happened with the wise men and when they went to Herod, and Herod went to the religious leaders? The religious leaders of Jesus' day could have argued all day long regarding their view. Well, you could have got them arguing all day long just talking about the resurrection, because one group believed in it and the other group didn't. But they could have argued all of these things and all of the fine points of the law of Moses, and they missed the most desired prophetic fulfillment of our world. They missed it. And I wonder how many of us have been going to church for years and years and years and years. We've got all the right language. We can claim it. We can probably even argue theology with people. And we miss what God is doing right in front of us. Let me give you a little bit of advice. Your neighbor doesn't need you to explain your theory. They need you to show them with your life that Jesus has made a difference in it. Your coworker doesn't need a lecture. It doesn't matter how religious you code it. They just need to see that there is hope in this world. Your family doesn't need you to win another argument. It's Christmas, right? Families and arguments, that's what happens. They need to see that Christ is alive and well in your life. And that's the question that I would ask us this Christmas season. What are you watching? What are you paying attention to? Are you more concerned with your own opinions about tomorrow or the Spirit's promptings in your life today, right where God has you? Because it would be tragic to spend your whole life watching and end up missing what God was doing right in front of your life. And sometimes we get wound up in the things of the world. There's enough politics and crazy, stupid stuff out there for us to get wound up and engrossed in. There's enough drama in our own lives that we could get wound up and engrossed in. You see, what we focus on, what we are watching, impacts all of those things. So as I think about this, does any of that sound just a little bit familiar? I mean, it sounds a little bit like kind of a watchman that we've been talking about, doesn't it? A watchman is someone who waits with patient expectation. Even in those moments when nothing seems to be happening. It is a declaration that I will stand here until you show me something. Open my eyes and let me see. But I know we want things to happen today. God knows you want things to happen today. But I wonder what He wants to do in us in the process. A watchman recognizes the moment when it comes. Why? Because he or she has trained his or her senses to pay attention. A watchman not only sees and hears, but declares. You can't sit silent. To tell others what it is that you're seeing God do, how it is that you're seeing God move. You see, a watchman watches the right thing, not the distractions that are all around us, not the side issues, but pays attention to his or her assignment. And it's in that everyday, ordinary obedience that God often shows up and does some cool stuff. That's what we see in Simeon. That's what we see in Anna. They didn't give up. They didn't grow bitter. They didn't drift away because they waited for decades and decades and decades. And what happened is then when the moment came, they were ready. And I'll guarantee you, when Simeon had that young child in his hands, all of those years of waiting was irrelevant because he got to see God's promise. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit about why I believe God is moving today. Not someday, but today in our midst. And if we're not careful, we can be praying for God to do something. We can be watching even for God to do something, and we could ignore the things that he has stuck right in front of our faces. You see, I believe that we are at one of those moments in history where God is wanting, is desiring to do something amazing, not just in our church, but in the whole area surrounding us. And we get to be a piece of that. The only question is are we going to pay attention? Are we watching? Or are we distracted? Are we so wrapped up in our own stuff, in our own routines, that we miss what God is doing right in front of us? Simeon waited a long time. Anna waited a long time. But when redemption walked in, they were ready because they were paying attention. Now, I don't know where you are. My guess is that, there's enough of us in this room and watching us somewhere online that we are in a whole bunch of different places. But you might be in a place this morning where you've been waiting. I'll respond, to God, when I fix myself, right? When I'm good enough, when I clean up this part of my life, or I do this or do that. When it feels right or the right time. But I would say this to you in the words of the author of Hebrews. He said, today is the day of salvation, not tomorrow. When God knocks on your heart, when God, when the Spirit of God impresses upon you, an overwhelming conviction of the truth of who Jesus is, that is his invitation for you to join him. Simeon held Jesus and said, my eyes have seen your salvation. You see, Jesus isn't just a spiritual accessory. It's not something you put on a chain and put around your neck. He is salvation. He is not just salvation. He is the author of it. He is the finisher of it. He is the one who came, was born. That's why we celebrate Christmas. Not to celebrate a little baby in a manger, but to celebrate the reality of the gift, the sacrifice that was made for us. That Jesus came so that he could die on a cross for your sin and my sin. So that God could raise him from the dead and conquer death, overcome death on our behalf, that we might live and live abundantly. And so if you feel that knocking on your heart this morning, tomorrow is not the time to respond. Today is. And so, don't wait for a better time, because there won't be one. All kinds of other ways that we could respond this morning. But I would just simply leave us with this. Can we walk out of here this morning with a conviction and a commitment to paying attention? It's Christmas. I know everybody gets busy. Everybody gets wrapped up in all kinds of stuff and activities. But could we just commit ourselves to maybe having a fresh look at Christmas? Pay attention to the people that God might bring around you. Pay attention to that still small voice, that whisper in your heart that God might be drawing you. And you know the cool thing about what we all saw this morning? God uses events like the obedience of one young child to inspire oftentimes others. So if he has the courage to stand up and say, yes, Jesus is my Lord and Savior, maybe I can too. So wherever you might be, whatever your circumstance in life, leave here this morning with a fresh set of eyes and a new conviction in your heart that just says, God, show me. But be careful, because he will. And he just might take you down a path that you wouldn't believe even if he laid it out for you. Exciting times are ahead, I believe, for us as a church and for each one of us individually. Stand with me, will you?